Peer Review is a series of podcasts designed to shed light on the extraordinary breadth and diversity of talent that sit in the House of Lords. The House of Lords often gets a bad rap because it is thought to be a house of cronies and it is an unelected house. But I hope through these interviews you will see that there is this extraordinary talent, there is a great knowledge and experience, and with that I leave you to draw your own conclusions. Well, my guest today is none other than Lord Udny-Lister. I've always known him as Eddie Lister, but he's got this wonderful surname. Born in Hammersmith, Eddie.
Correct.
And went to a school that I'd never heard of called the London Nautical School. Tell me about that. Why and where?
Oh, well, this is back. You must remember that back when I was 11, I had this desire to go to sea and join the Navy and sail the world and, in fact, be anywhere other than London. That was a dream that never actually came to fruition because I'd changed my mind by the time I left school.
So what did you say, Dad, I want to do that. Can you send me a school that's going to teach me to do it?
Well, it was actually, my parents separated a long time ago when I was very, very young. So it was just my mother. And I'd expressed that view and she'd identified this school and that's how I ended up there. It was a strange place. It was
in Blackfriars?
It was in Blackfriars.
Is it still going?
I think it's still going strong. I think it's an academy nowadays. Right. In those days, it was actually a technical school. There were a few of them that were created under the 44 Education Act, grammar schools, technical schools and secondary moderns, and this was one of the few technical schools that was created. And it was designed to train you for the Merchant Navy. It wasn't for the Royal Navy. And it was an unusual school. It was a very small school by today's standards. I think it was only 2 forms of entry, and it stayed like that. So you can imagine that was a pretty unusual secondary school. But it still managed to do A-levels and everything else. It still coped. And it did subjects like navigation and seamanship. Indeed, I have an O-level in seamanship, I've got to tell you. It's never been much use to me, but I do have it.
Have you ever driven a boat?
No, not really.
I thought that was the case. So you get to the end of this heroic time at school and decide that the Navy is not for you.
Yeah.
And did you go? You didn't go to university, I don't
No, I didn't. I went off to join a firm that's long since ceased to exist, up in Manchester called Mather & Platt, which was a very old engineering company. It was one of those companies that existed.
Very famous.
It was famous in its day. It was everything from pumps to motors to trains to... It made everything. It had its own foundries, 5,000 people. And I was on a sort of training course there, working my way through.
Long place from home.
A long way from home. But I didn't stay there that long because I then got moved to the London office. So I then returned home.
Right.
And so I then had... In fact, the London office is now the Department for Education in Smith Street. Great Smith Street. So I really, that was the beginning of my work career.
Until you became this sort of global expert on alarms and security. And in '69 you became a director of an alarm and security company.
That's right. And that started, and then not that long afterwards it was a company that was acquired by Michael Ashcroft. But there's a sort of amusing little story on the way to this.
Michael Ashcroft being the very well-known peer.
Correct, same one of the same. I was working I was originally with Mather & Platt, but time had moved on and the company had been sold by then, and that part of it I was working on was acquired then by Michael Ashcroft. But before he acquired it, I had also become leader of Wandsworth Council.
In 1976, you'd become a councillor in 76.
Councillor in 76, and then I became the leader of the council about 1982, I think it was. I
thought 92, but there we are.
92.
Yeah.
But before I became leader of the council, I was chairman of the education committee, and we were very, very keen on technical schools. And there was city technology colleges had just come into existence under Margaret Thatcher. And we were terribly keen to get one in Wandsworth. And so I got involved in some approaches to a couple of different people. But one of them was Michael Ashcroft, who was keen to set up a city technology college. And in Wandsworth, we had a large secondary school that was empty. So I was busy negotiating the purchase, or rather his purchase through the City Technology College Trust, of this school. And one morning he phoned me up to say, well, I've got news for you. The negotiations are going very, very well, but you're now an employee of mine because I've just taken over the company you work for. Which I, at that point, had to immediately withdraw from all negotiations and everything else. And in fact, the town clerk of Wandsworth at the time had to then get in touch with the Department of Education and then the Department, I think it was called the Department of the Environment back in those days. It dealt with local government because they had to get special dispensations because I'd been negotiating with somebody who was now my employer. So
this was back in '87. At that point, Michael Ashcroft had no interest in politics. He wasn't involved at all, was he?
He wasn't involved at all. There was nothing about politics on his side at that point.
It was round about the late 90s that he got involved in politics.
That's right. And I remember having conversations with him, funnily enough, in Blackpool at a party conference or, over a dinner where he had one or two people with him. And he was starting to become very interested in politics. He just started to go along to party conferences. And indeed, that was the one he did actually make a speech at.
Have your paths crossed politically much since?
Not really politically,
no.
But our paths have just crisscrossed over time because
you ended up working for him until 2007.
So he knew what I was doing. He knew I was there. When I decided I did decide at one point that I'd go for a parliamentary seat, and he was very supportive of me doing that, but it didn't come to pass. And so time went on. But our paths just continued to cross.
Going back to your time as a councillor, I mean, you were roughly about your late 20s when you stood for it and became a councillor. How do you marry the bit of, obviously, public service with working? I mean, obviously, it's something that should be encouraged, but do your employers sort of say, you're spending a bit too much time with the council, especially when you became leader in 76? In 92, rather.
Yes. It undoubtedly worked to my disadvantage in business doing it. I think I was successful enough for it not to matter too much because I was always able to achieve what I had set out to achieve. I always achieved whatever the targets were, the acquisitions of companies, because I got involved in that, the sales targets, the installation targets, all the other things. So I think if you actually achieve, you can get away with quite a lot. I think if I wasn't achieving, it would have been a different story.
But so you became leader in 92 till 2011, which is a long old slog.
Yeah.
And you were known primarily for value for money, I think, was the sort of cry.
Yes.
Wandsworth had very low council tax.
Yes.
Compared to its other boroughs. What was your real...
You must understand, back when I became a councillor, I was always quite clear, and some of the other people who became councillors at the same time as me, who are now MPs, people like Sir Paul Beresford, Chris Chope, they are still existing MPs. And there were a number of others that came through the Wandsworth organisation at one time or another. And we were always very clearly a political council. We believed very firmly in value for money. We were surrounded by authorities which charged very high council tax. We made a positive decision that we were going to be low council tax. We cut a lot of services. Long before other authorities ever did. We did privatisation long before anybody else did. And perhaps we were fortunate in one sense that the previous Labour administration, because Wandsworth had been Labour, had acquired an enormous amount of property. And we deliberately disposed of that. It wasn't difficult to dispose of it because nearly all of it was empty. It was a classic case of bad management. There were, when we took over, hundreds or indeed over 1,000 empty properties in the borough boarded up. Before you even got into a couple of estates, there was something like 7 schools that had virtually no children in them. This kind of thing. So we were fortunate in having a lot of assets that we were able to get hold of. And with those assets, we were able to reduce our borrowing to nothing, other than that which related to the housing revenue account, or that which was actually on such low interest rate it would be pointless to ever get rid of it. So we were a council with no borrowings, which was very unusual. In fact, I think we were the only one in the country to be in that position.
Yeah.
And a bit later on, we actually didn't even have a housing revenue account. We got rid of that as well. We had absolutely no money out with other people. Now, that made us able to do things other people couldn't do. So a combination of no debt, privatised services, being absolutely ruthless about what we would and wouldn't fund. So we didn't do weird and wonderful things, which many of our neighbours did. But we also did provide really good quality services in the areas of street cleaning, libraries, parks, the things that really mattered to people. And that combination actually worked well.
It came to an end in 2011 when
Yes.
you became Deputy Mayor of London and Chief of Staff to the then Mayor, Boris Johnson. How did that come about? Did you know Boris well?
Not well.
Simon Milton had died, I think, who was his Deputy Mayor and Chief of Staff.
Yes.
Did you know Boris well? Did you know what you were letting yourself in for?
Not really. I knew him because he had been around the London scene. He'd been elected in 2008, so I'd been involved with his election.
You were on the audit committee.
I was on. He soon after he was elected, he put together a small audit committee to look for savings on the Greater London Authority, and I was very involved with that. And we were able to identify massive savings that could be obtained quite quickly. And so he knew me. He knew me because of that work. And he'd been around the London scene. And then unfortunately, he'd had one chief of staff that hadn't worked. Then he'd got Sir Simon Milton in, and Sir Simon had been there for about 18 months, I think, by then. And he'd become very ill. And I remember having a conversation with 2 or 3 people. Linton Crosby, somebody you know quite well, mentioned it to me and said, you should think about doing this. A couple of other people talked to me about it. Anyway, I didn't do much about it until, very sadly, Simon died. And then Boris approached me. And I suppose I probably thought about it for all of 30 seconds and said yes. I mean, it was the perfect time for me. I'd been in Wandsworth too long. I knew it was time to move.
And you retired from Tyco?
I was doing a job with Tyco, but it was a bit of a. I was looking after a lot of regulatory stuff.
Yeah.
It was. I was coasting.
Timing was right.
Timing was perfect for me, and it also sounded very exciting. And and Boris is a very charismatic person. So he comes and does a sales job on you.
It's quite hard to say no.
It's difficult to say no.
Yeah, and it was a very harmonious working relationship when he was mayor, of course.
Yes. Well, he was extremely good. And he'd gathered around him. He'd learned from his first year or so in City Hall, where he'd made some terrible mistakes. I think because nobody thought he was going to get elected in 2008. And therefore, there was no planning done for who should take on any of the roles. And I don't think in those days people really understood how big City Hall really was. And it was gaining power now, and it was growing. So he had a very difficult year or so, and then he'd started to appoint a number of very, very good people. A number of them have stayed with him all the way to the end. A number of them have appeared in the House of Lords. A number of them are quite well known in their own right. And he had a good team he'd put together. And so to become, as I was, his chief of staff and also his deputy mayor for policy and planning, it was a bit of a dream job. I mean, it was well run, and it was a very successful.
And what were the sort of key issues you dealt with. Obviously, you and I got involved in the Battersea project and the regeneration of Tottenham. Me from the ministerial side, you from the government. I mean, those were two great projects. But what were the other things that, and clearly with your experience of Wandsworth, the whole housing issue became huge and you've allowed a lot of development.
The things I'm most proud of, I set up it was called a projects management committee soon after I arrived. And the purpose behind it was to bring some degree of control over policy papers as they came through, and also to be able to manage the flow of paperwork that comes through in an organised way. And it was this body, it met every week, and what it did was it basically took all the new ideas that were coming through, made sure they had a home to be processed through, and then as they approached a policy paper that could be presented to the mayor, it made sure there was a policy paper which stood the test of time, which had been signed off by all the right people, whether it was legal, finance, whatever, and then it could go to the mayor. And that was very successful in managing a very complex organisation, because City Hall is very complex, because it's a bit like a corporate holding company. City Hall itself is not that big, but by the time you bring in the police, transport for London, you start bringing in housing, you start bringing in all the sort of odds and ends like London and Partners, which was the Inward Investment Agency, and other things like this, you do need somewhere to capture some of this stuff. Now, and
people say that you were the person behind the sort of building boom, the housing boom.
Yeah. Well, Boris,
pulling planning in, things like that.
Boris was always clear. He was always very, very excited about the Grand project. That's what he liked. But he also recognised he had real power with housing, and he wanted to do things with it. He did want more housing. He did want London to grow. And so there were two major thrusts in that. The first one was the planning one, where we rewrote the London plan. We set up a series of development corporations. We created opportunity areas, 26 big opportunity areas across London. Battersea was an opportunity area. The Olympic Park was another one. And I can go on with some of the others. And these were all created. And these were where we were really going to direct most of our effort into, to make sure they could move forward. So that was a combination of planning, it was getting out there, talking to people, and it was also about trying to get external finance in, and that's where our paths first started to cross, because we were looking for investors. The Malaysians with Battersea Power Station is an example of that. But Boris did go around the world advertising London, telling people London was the place to invest in. He went to the Middle East, he went to India, he went to China, he went to the US, he went to all of those places. And a lot of foreign money was coming in because of that. Plus, we had a planning regime which had a clear plan. We knew where we wanted the buildings. That was quite clear to us. The boroughs had largely bought into it, although we did quite often have to call things in because they then changed their mind and we had to look at them. But we really got a lot of construction moving. And we had a target originally of 32,000 homes a year. We exceeded that. We then became 40,000. We then headed towards 50,000. London had never had so many.
And now it's gone backwards, presumably, is it?
Now the starts in London are negligible.
Yeah.
I mean, London has gone full circle. It's far worse than it ever has been in the past. And that's because if you want housing, you have to drive it. And we were also very pragmatic. We wanted social housing, but we wanted lots of things. And so it was always a balancing act.
Yeah.
We would get new stations if that's what the place needed. We would get new roads. We would get whatever we wanted. And often those things then led to the next thing. It was a good period of time.
So Boris ends his mayoralty. You are out of work because you go with him, obviously. There's a new mayor. Boris didn't stand for re-election. And then there's this sort of interregnum where Boris is foreign secretary and an MP, and suddenly at some point you get the call to become his chief of staff at number 10.
Yeah, well, I wasn't exactly not working from 2016 to 20...
but we weren't working in public service.
Yes, I'd Greg Clark. I'd had a conversation with Greg Clark about the Homes
and he was at that point the housing.
He was the
Secretary of State.
Yes, he was Secretary of State for now whatever.
Well,
whatever that department
housing.
was called at that point, I can't. It's a department that's changed names almost annually. But yes, he was responsible for housing, and he got me to apply for the job of chairman of the Homes and Communities Agency, and with a very clear brief that it was to be changed from that into a housing organisation. It became Homes England. It ran the government's Help to Buy scheme, which was massively successful. In fact, my great worry with it was always that it was too successful in a way. It was highly profitable for the Treasury in cash terms, which is why I've never really understood why government's always been so keen to get rid of Help to Buy. I know it's often accused of pushing up house prices, but I don't believe that to be the case. It, of course, was a massive amount of money on the balance sheet, which is probably its real problem. But anyway, it had government land, it had money to spend, and it was a very exciting period doing that. Mm. So it was a continuation. And I was trying to do...
Did you keep in touch with Boris as much as one does?
Yes. I was a director of the Foreign Office, a non-exec director of the Foreign Office. I did see him periodically. But Boris is somebody you sort of...
You're out of sight, out of mind with Boris.
Yes.
Isn't that true?
Yes, very true.
Yeah.
I think he sort of remembers you when you're in one of the areas of specialism that he wants and needs brought back in.
Yeah.
But yeah. But then...
And in 2019, when he became Prime Minister, he did.
Well, he rang me, actually, right at the beginning of his campaign and said, would I come and do some work for him in helping put his campaign together, but mainly to think about what it would be like being in government. He'd been scarred by the 2008 experience of City Hall, of arriving there with no plan to take over, and he knew he had to have a plan. So the first thing that I did, even before he was elected, I'd already mapped out what he was going to do in the first month or 6 weeks of office, about visiting the whole country, doing various things. I was very involved in the whole levelling up plan. And that was all very exciting. So I started working for him.
But when the call came, I suspect you were iffy about doing it.
A little bit iffy. I mean, I was iffy in the sense...
this was to be as Chief of Staff, working with Dominic Cummings.
Well, no, you must remember Dominic Cummings arrived a little bit later on in the scene. I was there and putting all this together, got various people involved, got various people recruited, several of them now still in number 10, got all those people lined up, and then really just before the actual election itself, he told me that he wanted to bring Dominic Cummings in. And I always remember the conversation. I said, why? He said, I've got to have... The civil service are going to destroy me. I know they are. And I never agreed with him on that. And indeed, I arranged private meetings between himself and Mark Sedwell, who was the Cabinet Secretary at the time. So I never felt that the civil service was his enemy. I always felt the enemy would actually come from within the Conservative Party. And in fact, I regret to say it, but I think I've been proved right on that.
You sat in a desk opposite Dominic Cummings.
Yes.
And I don't think I can think of two more different people. I was going to say difficult. Not difficult, different people in personality terms. What was that like?
Difficult. Look, I mean, in truth, we were totally different. There was always a bit of a struggle going on between us. We managed to work together. To be completely fair, I worked with Dominic Cummings and he worked with me. We both wanted to make it work, and it did. He had his priorities, and I left him to those, and I had mine, and he rather left me alone with what I was wanting to prioritise. So we sort of there muddled through, really, but it was not a satisfactory position, I think, for either of us. But in some ways, it sort of suited the way Boris liked to work. He did like to have different viewpoints round the table.
A lot of people say that he did it quite a lot, changed his mind during a meeting a lot. And what were those meetings like? I mean, when you'd have him and Dominic?
Well, you've got to remember that, this is how I like to think of it. Boris is a journalist. He likes to see both sides of an argument. He likes it laid out before him. He doesn't want to hear one-sided arguments. He's not going to sign something off without hearing some
good
discussion.
thing.
I think that's a good thing. And I think any Prime Minister who just nods things through is a disaster. He wanted to hear both sides of the argument. And it wasn't always me that would put up an argument against Dominic Cummings, or indeed neither Dominic Cummings or I may have been involved. It might have been other people. But he would always like to hear an argument take place in a very professional way. Please don't get me wrong, nobody was shouting at each other or anything like that, but he'd like to hear the two sides of an argument spelt out across the table, and he wouldn't really trust it unless he had both sides of the argument there. And he would then make his decision about what he felt was right. He may have made the decision beforehand, and the disagreements would have confirmed what he thought, but sometimes he did change his mind over something. And that was true with ministers as well. It was that regularly did take place.
People say that, obviously, that it was quite chaotic.
No, I don't think it was.
You're not a chaotic operator.
No, it wasn't chaotic. People like to say it's chaotic. They like to say it's chaotic because whatever they were pushing didn't get through. So obviously it's chaotic. It's not that their idea was rubbish or wasn't accepted by the Prime Minister. It was not chaotic. It was a pretty straightforward operation. It was well programmed in the sense that he always had an 8:30 meeting. At 8:30, he would go through the issues of the day. He would have a report from the press office. The highlights of the press would be told to him. The day would be mapped out. Now, the problem is, for a Prime Minister, there's always events. There's always things happening which you can't plan on. They emerge. They may have just emerged that morning and would he would hearing about them for the first time, or maybe he'd heard them, in the half hour or hour since he'd got up beforehand, it would have come through. Mm-hmm. So this would happen, but
number 10 is crisis management.
It is. It is, and it's a vast organisation. It isn't a vast organisation, but the civil service is a vast organisation. It's feeding out through. There's material coming in. People don't realise the flow of data that goes into number 10 is amazing. Mm. There are duty clerks on 24/7 processing information through to the Prime Minister. It is an amazing amount of detail that's coming in there.
All going pretty well. Then the great COVID event happens. What was the atmosphere like then? How did everyone cope? You got it. Boris obviously had it incredibly badly. Most people in number 10 seem to have had it. What was it like? Frankly, the civil service didn't have a plan for it, did they?
No. And it was made worse by the fact that we just won an election in the December of 2019. And we had now for the first time, because remember, prior to that, it had all been about Brexit. It had all been about having to get Brexit done. It had been constant warfare with members of Parliament. Now, all of a sudden, there's a majority, there's an 80-seat majority. There's policies to be worked through. Everybody was looking forward to this. And then basically, within 2 months of that, we had this strange disease from China suddenly appearing, and we all know how that all originated. And COVID itself was pretty ruthless, because even when we started to talk about locking down, you remember number 10 has to keep working. Nobody could go home. We were all in number 10. And then COVID hit. And then it just went through Downing Street. It went through everybody. I don't think anybody escaped it. And it's just very unfortunate the Prime Minister had it worst of all. And he was very seriously ill. And we, indeed, for a long period of time, we really did wonder
who's going to make it.
What would happen. In fact, it's no real secret, but his private secretary, and I remember talking to his private secretary about this, had drawn up all the relevant paperwork that might be needed to be sent through to the Queen if he didn't pull through, or if he'd gone onto a life support machine. Because that was the real fear. And
it takes a long time to recover, doesn't it?
Yes, and he was never given any recovery time.
No.
I mean, everybody forgets that. And so everybody then talks about number 10 as though, we're all socially distanced. Well, you can't socially distance in number 10. It's a house.
Yeah.
It's very, very hard.
A lot of people in a small space.
Yeah. I mean, we did all the right things. We had screens up on desks and things like that. But as you said, Dominic Cummings and I were facing each other. That's how the place was. So it was pretty bad. It was a very strange time. There were some awful things that took place, and you're absolutely right. There was no real plan. And what was made worse was that there's no doubt about it that the Prime Minister was assured there was a plan, and there was no plan. He was assured there was plenty of PPE. There was no PPE. And I can go on like this. I mean, the system was not geared up for what was to take place.
Yeah.
And I think the most important thing was a series of meetings which the Chief Medical Officer and the Chief Scientific Officer were present at. And I remember this very, very clearly. And he turned round to them and said, well, what is the answer? And they said, well, ultimately it has to be herd immunity. It's the only way you're ever going to beat this. And for a very short time, like about 2 days, that was policy before it dawned on everybody that wasn't going to work because the death toll would be too high and all the rest of it. But in fact, the policy was to try and get to herd immunity. And the only way you can get to herd immunity was through vaccines. And the Prime Minister has to be given the credit for directing the civil service, directing the whole machine to get those vaccines. And he made it absolutely clear, and he asked the Chief Scientific Officer to name those companies that he thought could produce a vaccine, and he then told the system to go and place orders and buy it. Money was not the object. Nobody worried about money, because a few £1 million on vaccines was nothing compared to the damage we were doing to the economy.
Yeah. And Cummings goes in a blaze of glory, and you're not one of the people he accuses of being disruptive, which shows what you said, that you worked together. And then you, of course, leave because...
Well, I'd made it clear to Boris in the summer of 20... where are we? I've got to get
20.
20. That I wanted to leave because I knew there was no real space for both me and Dominic Cummings. What I didn't know was that Cummings had also had a similar conversation with Boris and said he was off as well. If only everybody had known about all these private conversations, things may have been different, but nobody did. And so I'd made it clear I wanted to move. I wanted to do some more work in the Middle East. I'd had a lot of contact in the Middle East while I'd been in number 10. He wanted me to do more stuff there, and I was beginning to pick some of that up. And then, unfortunately, we reached the stage where Dominic Cummings decided he was going to go and packed his box and went out the front door. Well, there are more discreet ways of leaving number 10 than the front door. But nevertheless, he went. And we then I was then on my own running things for a period of time, and then Boris wanted to bring somebody else in.
I mean, you must look back, his career had sort of crashed and burnt in a big way. And in some ways, the civil service did get him. And in some ways, as you said, the party got him. But at the end, most people would say he got himself.
I don't think so. Look, I think that there's a number of things here. He'd broken the mould in several ways. He'd done things no other Prime Minister had ever done before. His family life was very different from any other previous Prime Minister. And it all looked as though that was fine, but the party never really, a large section of it, never really forgave him for Brexit. He wasn't part of the club. His biggest weakness with MPs was he never really spent any time with them. He had no friends really in Parliament. He wasn't well connected into Parliament. He made, and it's not really his fault. In fact, it isn't his fault. It's just the circumstances of the time. But Parliament operated from home. So all the MPs in the March of 2020, March of 2020, were all sitting at home, having won this thumping great majority, you understand, because of their brilliant campaigning. Forget him for a second. I mean, we all know it is actually the leader that matters in campaigning, but they all believe that. And they're sitting there at home, not talking to any of their colleagues. They're all new, and they were all listening to social media. And I think that was a recipe for disaster. And I think that sowed the seeds for what took place later. They then came back. They didn't really know each other. They didn't know the process. They were not as disciplined as they should have been, because all discipline went out the window because of COVID. And I think that was part of the problem, in my opinion. Yeah. And then the second piece was, I still to this day don't understand how Number 10 let the parties get out of hand. Let me rephrase this. There were virtually no parties at Number 10. What there was a press office that regularly, on a Friday evening, used to have a drink amongst the people that were in the press office all day and every day. Yeah. So they were in a bubble. That is what is often being described as party. And there were no outsiders. And then there were 2 or 3 other incidents where things took place. But he wasn't really part of those. And you know him as well as I do. He's not somebody who goes to parties. No, he's not interested in it. No. And Number 10 should have killed the whole party thing off but didn't. Right at the beginning, and didn't. And I do blame other people for that.
So are you sure that you shouldn't have become a mariner?
Well, I'll tell you what, it would have been less hours than some of this has been over the years. I mean, all I've done is get up very early in the morning and go to bed very late at night for a very long time.
You've been fantastic to civil society and have committed yourself well and truly to it, Ed. And I'm incredibly grateful for you sparing the time to tell us about your life. It's been fascinating. Thank you very much.